Killer Angels by Michael Sharra. A spy moves across a field towards the Confederate camp. He's made the shocking discovery that the Army of the Potomac is moving north, startlingly close to the Confederate Army. He first reports to General Longstreet. Longstreet doubts the reports of the Union Army being so close. Despite his doubts, the spy is able to convince Longstreet that the Army is in fact in that place. Longstreet then goes to tell General Lee with the spy in tow. Lee is also quite doubtful and skeptical of the spy since General Stuart has not reported to him on any sort of intel, though Longstreet, who believes that Stuart is simply joyriding, is able to convince Lee to move the army west towards the path of the Union Army. Now, in the Union Army, Colonel Chamberlain is awakened by Kilrain, a private in the 20th Maine, the regiment in which Chamberlain is commander. He comes awake to the news that he has been put in charge of about 120 mutineers from the 2nd Maine. Once Chamberlain gathers himself, he gets the mutineers, who had marched for quite some time, some food. He then makes a stirring speech to the men, telling them he will not kill them if they do not fight as he was told to do so, and that any who wish to join may. All but 6 join. General Buford, commander of the Union cavalry, comes upon the town of Gettysburg and is horrified and surprised to find a brigade of Confederate infantry that is just outside the town, without cavalry. The brigade leaves and he decides to set up his troops in the western hills. This is in hope that when the larger Confederate forces arrive, they might be able to defend the high ground around This is in hope that when the larger Confederate forces arrive, they might be able to defend the high ground until General Reynolds, commander of the Union infantry, is able to arrive. Buford sends General Reynolds the intel he's gathered. Buford also takes notes of the many different points of higher ground around the town. We now come on General Longstreet from a distance, watching as many of the troops attempt to teach Fremantle, a British officer observing the army, how to play poker. Longstreet is brooding on the report of Union cavalry in Gettysburg, though some speculate it may just be a militia. He then speaks to General Pickett. Pickett is concerned that the fact that his unit, which has not seen much action, is again in the rear of the army. Longstreet assures him that he will see action and will be pivotal. He then speaks with Armistead, an officer under Pickett and whose friend is in the Union Army, General Winfield Hancock. Longstreet talks of how he wishes the war to be defensive, for the army to use trenches. Armistead agrees, but says that this is not the time to test such things. General Lee rises in the morning to begin the day's march toward Gettysburg. He wakes with some issues of the heart and decides to be a bit more relaxed. He consults with his aide, Taylor, on his concern about Stuart not having returned, as many of the officers wish for Stuart to be court-martialed, though Lee, who sees the man as a good soldier, does not wish to do so. Longstreet then comes with the report that the new commander of the Union Army is General Meade. Lee then tells Longstreet that he needs to be careful as Lee sees him as the most valuable officer in the Confederate Army, and that he needs him. Though Longstreet does mention that he wishes that the army would move southeast and cut the Union Army off from Washington. Lee becomes cross with Longstreet at his saying so, as he does not commend Longstreet's great love for defensive warfare. In Gettysburg, Buford is being attacked, thus he sends for Reynolds, hoping he'll come in time to relieve them. He orders his artillery to continue firing. The first few attacks had been softer and they were repelled easier, but the new attacks were harder and the troops had a harder time repelling them. In the nick of time, Reynolds arrives and sends his infantry, though he is killed early on in the battle and the attack continues without its head. General Lee comes upon a battle in full swing, and Heath's division has been pushed back. Heath tells Lee that what had happened and how he had not expected the fierce defense. Lee then speaks with General Rhodes, who tells him that his division has advanced on the northern Union flank and that General Early will join them soon. Lee also tells General Ewell to take the hill, Cemetery Hill. Ewell comes back saying he didn't in fear of a Union attack. Chamberlain's division moves ever forth towards Gettysburg. Chamberlain, left to daydream on the trek, has thought of how he has begun to love his life as a soldier, yet hated at the same time. They also pass through a town to much relief of the citizenry. Longstreet rides about observing the land of the area, brooding on the matter of Lee's more than sure want to attack up the hills and such of the Union line. He then talks to Fremantle for a while, who speaks of how close the Southerners are to Englishmen and such. Lee speaks with General Ewell, Early, and Rhodes. He asks Ewell why he did not take the hill, but then moves on to an attack he wishes to be carried out. He asks Ewell to attack the right flank. He says he will if Longstreet also attacks the left in return. Lee agrees. He then departs and goes to sleep, thinking of where the hell Stewart is. Buford observes the digging in of the Union troops. He then speaks with one of Hancock's men, who tells him that Howard blames Buford for the day's loss. Fremantle awakes in the Confederate camp on the morn of the second day of battle. He speaks briefly with one of his fellow Europeans, Russ, a fat Austrian. He then speaks with Longstreet about his concerns on the Confederates not having entrenched. He assures Fremantle that General Meade would never attack, as they were too well entrenched and too good a position. Fremantle then leaves to join the other Europeans, brooding on how American freedom and equality has failed in just 2 generations. The 20th Maine continues its march towards Gettysburg. Chamberlain is roused and informed that there's a black man who is wounded. He comes and sees the man and gets the surgeon to bind him. Despite himself, he feels a sense of revulsion and broods on it. A colonel tells Chamberlain that his unit is to be deployed on Little Round Top. Chamberlain then speaks with Kilrain about the thoughts he had, and how he thought that there was no real difference between black men and white men. Kilrain spoke of how they are both good and bad black men, and just as with white men. Chamberlain then remembers a time he had an argument with a Southern preacher on the matter, the preacher saying that they were no real men. A congregation of Confederate generals speak on a plan of how to attack the Union line. Ewell and Early complain that the Union center is far too concentrated, and if Longstreet were to attack around Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge, they may be able to take Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Lee commands Longstreet to do so, though Longstreet says it must be delayed so he can gain another brigade. The march begins later, and Longstreet and Lee ride together. They find themselves almost giddy, though Longstreet brings up the fact that they once vowed to protect this land, and Lee counters that they have a higher responsibility to Virginia. The conversation depresses the 2 men. Longstreet is then informed that if they continue, the troops will come in sight of the Union line, and thus he orders a countermarch nearly back to the start, wasting valuable time. Upon arrival, he finds that the Union line is not in fact on the ridge, but lower in a peach orchard. Yet he decides to follow through with the plan and attack in the center of the left flank. Chamberlain's regiment is commanded to hold the southwest side of Little Round Top. He is the extreme flank of the Union line, and thus must hold. His men begin to entrench immediately, building up a stone wall. He commands Morrill to take the left in case of an attempted flank. The Confederate attack begins, and the first attack is repelled. The attack continues, though. Kilrain is wounded, though it does not seem to be of any concern. Chamberlain gets his foot hit and begins to bleed, though he continues on. He gathers his commanders and tells them to hold the line. Another attack comes, and a hole in the line opens. He instinctively tells the closest man to plug it. The man is his brother, Tom. Though despite this, the boy is fine afterwards. The regiment begins to run low on ammunition, and thus Chamberlain orders a bayonet charge in the motion of a swinging door. The attack is successful, and the Confederates are pushed back. They take many prisoners. The regiment is now down to 200 men. He returns to Kilrain, who is declining from the wound he had taken earlier. He is taken off to receive better medical aid, and Chamberlain is commanded to move the division to Big Round Top. Longstreet speaks with General Hood after the failed attack. Hood was wounded and was therefore drug-induced, thus he was a little off. He asks if they had won. Longstreet fibs and tells him that the attack was indeed successful. Longstreet then departs to converse with Lee. Upon arrival, he sees Stewart, who is surrounded by reporters and such, who have come up from Richmond. He then speaks with Lee. Longstreet, once more, makes an attempt to convince Lee to move the army southwards and cut off D.C., though he is told to leave by one of Lee's aides. He is then confronted by Fremantle, who makes an attempt at congratulations for the victory that was won. He then tells Fremantle that there is no argument. Fremantle goes on to mention some other things, among them how the war was only really about slavery. Longstreet then departs and speaks with some of the other officers and mentions Fremantle's comment, though the others disagree. Longstreet says that it is what the war is about and why he is fighting. Lee finds himself in a moral quandary. He ponders on the matter that he had once vowed to defend the very land he fought against. He then speaks with Stewart, giving him a dressing down, as to cow the man from any further insubordination. Lee is then informed that Ewell attacked late in the offensive, and thus the plan failed. Lee then decides that they must attack in the center. Chamberlain speaks with many of the men in his regiment, seeing how they are doing after the battle. All the while he feels bad about the fact that he plugged the hole in the line with his brother Tom. His foot also still hurts. which he seems to be continuously reopening the wound. He also finds himself missing the company of Kilrain. He is then confronted by an aide, and Chamberlain notifies him that they have need of ammunition and rations desperately. The aide then notifies him that the regiment has been relieved and will be moved to the center, a quiet place in the line. We come to Longstreet, who is preparing for an attack that he knows is to come. He tries to talk Lee out of it once more, but Lee insists and says that they will attack in the center, towards a clump of trees on Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet folds as he sees that Lee will not back down now. He departs to go tell his officers of the attack. He gathers them and explains the attack, the objective, and the positioning. All of his officers seem enthusiastic and full of heart for the attack. Despite the enthusiasm and Lee's confidence in the attack, Longstreet knows that there will be heavy casualties with the attack. Chamberlain and his regiment finally arrive in the center of the line. Chamberlain then leaves to speak to General Sykes, who praises him for his performance in the battle. He also hints at promotion. Chamberlain then leaves and procures some chicken for the regiment. He then speaks with his brother, but suddenly the Confederate artillery opens fire and Chamberlain passes out behind a stone wall, slipping in and out of consciousness. Armistead walks about the camp before the attack, seeing many of the officers doing things before the battle. He sees Garnett, who is going to ride a horse into battle due to his bad foot, despite orders forbidding it. He knows the risk and expects to die. He only wishes that his honor will be restored. He then sees Longstreet crying, a spectacle to be sure. Longstreet then gathers himself and makes an order to begin the advance. Once everyone is in order and the artillery is halted, they advance. Almost immediately casualties begin to stack up as shells hit the line. Man after man dies as they advance through the field. Once they reach the Union line, fatalities only increase in number. Then men begin to retreat. Armistead finds himself shot, and when he is in his final breaths, he asks a Union soldier to send his regrets to his friend Hancock. Longstreet is horrified at the spectacle that has unfolded. He, in a moment of fear and anger, picks up a rifle, as if to join in at the final futile attempts to win the day. He sees Lee as well, who's telling the troops the failure is all his fault. Longstreet continues on, and only after one of his aides is hit by a shell is he able to be stopped. Lee informs him that he means to withdraw the army and retreat. Chamberlain sees the aftermath of the battle, a gray, bloody field full of bodies. He remembers how he used his brother to plug a hole in the line, and wants to send him back so he may not be distracted by his presence. Chamberlain's desire to protect his brother, no doubt. He then sees a storm that washes some of the blood off the land. Tom comes over and they together return to the regiment.